Good afternoon. It's great to see all of you here, and we have many people watching it online as well. I'm Larry Horton, president of the Stanford Historical Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program, Stanford Student and Faculty Diversification in the 1970s. Our speaker today is uniquely qualified to discuss this topic, the origins of Stanford's systematic efforts to diversify its faculty and student body. Arthur Bienenstock, professor of photo science emeritus, has a long and distinguished career in basic scientific research and national research policy. Here at Stanford, Artie, since the late 1960s, has been deeply involved in teaching, serving on committees, and holding leadership positions dealing with the quality of the student body and faculty. Artie has held a number of major posts at Stanford and nationally. For 2 decades, he was director of the Stanford Synchrotron Radiation Light Source. He was vice provost and dean of research, and of special importance to today's topics, Artie was chairman of the Stanford Faculty Senate's Committee on Undergraduate Admissions and Financial Aid. Some of Artie's most noteworthy contributions were his service as a senior member of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House under President Clinton, and as a member of the National Science Board, which oversees national science policy, and as president of the American Physical Society. Artie is also a voracious consumer of the arts and an active citizen here. Artie?
Before I begin, I want to thank some people. Karen, Adrian, and Josh helped me a lot with the research. Remember, I'll be covering events that are half a century old. Conversations with Al Camarillo, Jerry Porras, and Claude Steele also influenced this talk a great deal. Finally, I owe a debt to Frank Sotomayor via email, who, among other things, got me messages from the 4 people listed below his name who corrected a serious error on my part and whose thinking also influenced this talk considerably. I came to Stanford in 1967, and my focus at the beginning was completely on forming my research group, preparing lectures on a quarter system, which I hadn't experienced before. So it was quite a surprise when I was told that I had been assigned to the Financial Aids Committee. That was a real experience for me in the following sense. Bob Huff was the director, and he introduced me for the first time to the concept of needs-blind admission. That is, you admit the freshman class without looking at their financial needs, and then you meet those needs with a mixture of scholarship, jobs, and loans. The second thing that Bob stressed was that you want to keep the loans as small as possible because we expect most Stanford graduate students, undergraduates, to go on to either graduate school or professional school. Now that takes money. And I helped Bob. He would ask me to meet with prospective donors to financial aid, which I did gladly because I believed in those 2 concepts strongly, which resulted in me 1 year after I arrived at Stanford being made chair of that committee. Fortunately, that was an uneventful experience except for fundraising. That last spring, though, the Academic Senate was formed, and it combined admissions with financial aids to the Committee on Undergraduate Admissions and Financial Aids to which I'll call C-UAFA. We had a new dean, Fred Harganen, who is a significant factor in this talk. And it was really weird, as I look back on it, that I was made chair of that committee. I had only been here 2 years. I was in 2 graduate-only departments, so I had virtually no experience with undergraduates. And what's more, I had no sense of the history of the issues with which I was about to deal. And for my part, I had no idea what I was getting into. I assumed it was going to be something uneventful, like the Financial Aids Committee had been. The charge, however, to the committee, let me talk about the membership, because it's important. Virtually all of the members on the committee were senior faculty members at the time, except for Diane Middlebrook, a young assistant professor, and Larry Diamond, an undergraduate. The 2 of them contributed enormously to the committee and went on to do a great deal of things here at Stanford. But everyone on the committee played a role, and I depended on them, given my lack of own experience. C-UAFA was charged by the Senate to review recommendations by the Study on Education at Stanford, SES. Those recommendations sought to really tie the hands of the Dean of Admissions, Rixford Snyder. I won't go into detail, but that was basically to remove Snyder's discretion. What I didn't know at the time was that there was a lot of faculty unrest over the low proportion of Jews among the undergraduate body. They suspected Snyder of discrimination against Jews, but they had never really come up with any proof about it, and they basically wanted to tie his hands. But I, knowing none of that, just steered the committee towards the questions: would we get a better freshman class if we followed the SES recommendations, or if we followed Fred Harganen's approach? And ultimately, we came down in favor of Fred Harganen's approach, which was twofold. First, we should have students with very high scholastic capabilities, but we have a very large number of student applicants with high scholastic capabilities. The second, that we should look for outstanding achievements, very broadly considered. What I didn't think about at the time is, what are the most common ways that high school students gather excellent achievements? They're either in athletics or in music. And indeed, that's probably why Stanford is so strong in both athletics and music. But he thought much more broadly than that, thank goodness. One day, though, Fred walked into the committee and said, "You won't believe it, but I've realized that Stanford has not been recruiting at schools with significant number of Jews, including the Bronx High School of Science and a comparable high school in Philadelphia and Cleveland and in Los Angeles." So it was Fred who saw one of the patterns of restrictions on the number of Jews that could be students at Stanford. Later, from Charles Peterson, we learned of more that was going on at the time. Fred announced his intention to recruit at those institutions, and basically that was the start of an increase in the number of Jewish students coming to Stanford. That experience, though, led to the fundamental question to which I want to address, and that is, what talented students had Stanford failed to enroll because of its limited recruitment? What talent did we miss out on as a consequence of that? The other thing that struck me, because I hadn't thought about these issues, is where you recruit matters and how you recruit. The message you send really matters. The Senate accepted our approach, and that was the end of the SES recommendations. The following fall, the Black Students Union made a series of demands addressed to President Lyman. They demanded that the next freshman class be 12% Black, that the applicants, the Black applicants, be reviewed by a Black admissions committee, which would screen those applicants and present a list to the regular admissions office. Related requests had been made by the Chicano students via their organization, MECHA. I was completely unaware of the previous history involved, and in fact, only really came to terms with it when I saw a book that Al Camarillo recommended to me, The Dawning of Diversity by Frank Sotomayor. And let me summarize my impressions from that book. And that is, Black and Chicano students had made similar proposals in the spring of 1967, prior to my arrival here at Stanford. The proposals had been dealt with by the central administration, not by the faculty. Remember, the Senate didn't exist at that point, nor did C-UAFA. As a consequence of those demands, Jim Simmons and Luis Nogales had been appointed as Black and Chicano assistants to the president. We had, in addition, a Black and a Chicano assistant dean of admissions in the admissions office, and probably, my impression, the most important thing for the Chicano group was that we had accepted the idea that our existing Chicano students would go out and recruit other Chicano students. You can see the last class that Rixford Snyder admitted, out of a total of 1,400 students, there were 63 Blacks and 71 Chicanos, short of the 100 to which the president had committed. Upon reading, probably in the daily, of the Black Students Union demands, I sent a note to President Lyman saying, admissions policies are my committee's purview, not yours. I didn't put it so bluntly, but that was it. And surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, President Lyman agreed. We spent the following most of the academic year meeting with representatives of the BSU, with representatives of MECHA, and we focused primarily on those BSU demands, although it was clear that any policy decisions that we made would apply to both groups. In the meantime, Fred Hargadon did an analysis of the class, of the applicants to the class that Rixford Snyder had admitted. And this is what he found, that we did not have enough qualified applicants to meet the 12% demand, that every qualified Black student had been admitted, and that those students who had not been admitted showed academic and non-academic achievements significantly below those normally used as a basis for admission to Stanford. As a consequence of that analysis, by that time we really trusted Fred for his integrity and his intelligence. CUAFA turned down the Black Students Union demands. In a memo to the BSU, and as well in a report to the Academic Senate, we said we cannot meet the BSU demand for 12% Black students in the freshman class. What's more, we do not agree to the idea that there should be limits or quotas on the number of students from each ethnic and religious group, that the nature of the admitted pool should reflect the nature of the applicant pool. The applicant pool should decide who is admitted to the institution. And finally, that we believe that the actual reading of the application should be done by the Office of Admissions. We said, finally, that whereas Stanford is well prepared and has an obligation to prepare leaders in the society, we are ill-prepared to provide remedial training. It was a pretty strong statement. Nevertheless, I want to talk about three of the people that I remember best from those discussions. First is Roscoe Giles. Roscoe was chair or leader of the Black Students Union at the time. He was a University of Chicago undergraduate. He was the first African American to earn a Stanford PhD in theoretical physics. He went on to be a faculty member at Boston University, where he gained renown, both for his advances in computational science and his leadership there, as well as being the first BU faculty member to be on the board of BU's trustees. The second was Charles Ogletree. Charles, a son of California tenant farmers and the first in his family to graduate from high school, got a BA and an MA in political science. He went to Harvard Law School, where he was president of the Black American Law Students Association. Harvard appointed him to the faculty. He became a well-known civil rights lawyer, was on our board of trustees, and a mentor and advisor to Barack Obama. Luis Nogales, son of migrant workers, San Diego State undergraduate. As you can see, a founding leader of MECHA while he was a Stanford law student. He was our first assistant to the president for Mexican-American affairs after he graduated, first White House fellow, first Latino Stanford trustee, and the trustee of many organizations, very active in Chicano affairs nationally. Why do I bring these people up? First of all, they were a formidable group. And we felt we wanted more people like that at Stanford. And it was perhaps the character of the people with whom we negotiated, not only those three, but others who came to represent the BU and MECHA, which caused us to make a decision, one, that we would seek actively Black and Chicano students at Stanford, and two, that we remember the two criteria for admission. One's high scholastic achievement, other outstanding achievements, that we would seek to understand better the achievements relevant to the Black and Chicano communities. I'll say at the time, I was worried that there would be repercussions to me personally and to my family. But in fact, there was never any strong negative statement made to me by the BSU and by Mecha. And I wondered about it for years till after Claude Steele spoke here this recently. I asked Claude about it, and he said they had come to trust you and Fred, just as we on CUAFA had come to trust Fred. That trust was very important. Was that trust justified? You can see, to give a benchmark, in 1965, the freshman class was 1.7% Black and essentially 0 Latino. There were a few Chicano students. In response to the BSU and the Mecha demands in the spring of '67, and to the Chicano student recruiting, which was critically important. Rixford Snyder's last class was 4.5% Black and 5% Chicano. Fred's first class before these discussions were, you can read the numbers, 6.8% Black and 10.6% Chicano. I think that the '83 class was 9% Black and 9% Latino. I don't trust that number. I got it from ChatGPT. But where are we now? Which is important. The class is now 9% Black and 17% Latino. I think part of the rise in Black and Chicano students at Stanford is due to the fact that we did insist on finding outstanding students, and they just came in greater and greater numbers. The other important factor that I have to stress for the Chicano community was the recruitment by students who gave the impression to potential students that this is a place at which they are welcome. I also conclude, again from Frank's book, that our financial aid policies were critical factors in getting those Chicano students to come to Stanford. I point all of this out about the financial aid because remember that I spent a lot of time in Washington. So I always think nationally as well as for Stanford. Most universities do not have the funds to provide the financial aid at the level that we and a few well-endowed institutions have. And that has a big effect on the nation that I'll go into later on. At the start of the third year, I was bringing home a student to her dormitory at Stanford. She had been babysitting for us. And on the way home, she said to me, Artie, the ratio of men to women in the undergraduate body is not good for the men or the women. You are chair of CUAFA. You should do something about it. So I went to CUAFA and discussed it, and we set up a subcommittee chaired by Ann Miner, who was then a special consultant to the president on the academic affairs of women. And in the process, I learned that Mrs. Stanford had put a limit of 500 on the number of women that could be students at Stanford after Governor Stanford died. In the Depression, the Board of Trustees had interpreted that as the same percentage that 500 formed when Mrs. Stanford put in that limit. So that limit amounted to about 30% of the students at Stanford could be women. The subcommittee met under Ann's leadership for about 4 or 5 months. and came back with two options. One, that we mandate a 50-50 option, at 50-50 ratio of men to women in the class. The other, that we just eliminate the limit and have the applicant pool determine the ratio of men to women. Given the strong stand that we had taken on not setting quotas or limits in our discussions with the BSU and METRA, we went for the second option, that is to eliminate the limit. We took it to the academic senate, where, as far as I can remember, there were no votes about going in that direction. And then Bill Miller said, Artie, you have to take it to the Board of Trustees. So I prepared to take it to the Board of Trustees, but 2 weeks before I was to take it to the Board of Trustees, Robert Ming Brown, the chairman of the board, called and said, can we deal with the athletic ramifications of this? Well, I went with trepidation to see Joe Ritz, knowing that his job depended on the football team and the basketball team doing well, and wondering what he was going to say. I talked to him for about 5 minutes when he stopped me and he said, just do it. It's the right thing to do. Little did I know, and only decades later did I learn from Ray Purpura that Joe had been an advocate for women's sports, and indeed said to his staff when Title IX came in, other universities are trying to circumvent this. We are going to have the best women's athletic program in the country. I tell this story because there are so many heroes in this process, with me just moving along. Where did we stand in the class? Oh, I should mention that when I took it to the Board of Trustees, a week before I was to take it to the Board of Trustees, Bill Hewlett called the provost and said, tell Artie I've done my homework. If there are any problems, I'm prepared to back him up. Now, Bill at the board, he was usually quiet unless he saw the university tending towards expediency rather than excellence. Then he would always speak out and he would always win. So I felt really reassured knowing that Bill was prepared to back me up. In fact, when I gave the report to the board, the only comment from a male trustee was, it's about time. Finally, the lawyers in the spring of, I guess, '73 had to take it to court. And there we met our first opposition from a woman in Palo Alto who opposed the change. Fortunately, the judge just ruled her out of order, and the limit was eliminated from the founding grant. Here you can see the changes in the class. In '65, it was about 32% women. Fred's first class was 37% women. His last class, 44% women. And now we're up around 40% women. And all of that has happened pretty naturally. As the students learn that we welcome women as well as men students. I keep emphasizing the recruiting because I was a student at Bronx Science. I graduated in 1952. I had never heard of Stanford. I mean, I knew about Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and the like, but I had never heard about Stanford. Recruiting really matters. That year, 1971, I applied to be a fellow of the university. What was on my mind at the time? We were going through a budget adjustment program, basically a financial crisis, related to changes in the government's funding of research. You're familiar with that. And as a consequence, there were to be very few new hires. The question on my mind was, what institutional measures could we take to ensure that the faculty remained current? Previously, when we wanted to go into something new, we would bring a new faculty member here. But that seemed less of a possibility under this budget adjustment program. The provost called me in, and he said, on top of that, I want you to look at these affirmative action rules. They've been around for a number of years, but now the Department of HEW is enforcing them for universities. Take a look at them and see what you think we should do, since you're so concerned with faculty. I took them home, and a couple of weeks later, I returned and said three things. One, if we do this well, it will improve the institution. If we do it poorly, we will regret it for a long time. Two, the biggest initial effect is going to be on women, since they form an appreciable part of the doctorate pool, whereas it looks like it's aimed at minorities, but they're a much smaller fraction of the people who get doctorates. And three, while other universities are trying to figure out what to do, we should go aggressively after truly outstanding women and minority faculty members. Miller asked me if I wanted to take on the job, and given the troubles with the government at that point, I said yes. I was down to one graduate student at that point. The next year in May made me vice provost for faculty, including being faculty affirmative action officer. Marlene Wine became my assistant, and that proved to be valuable. And that role became important because in that role, I read every appointment and promotion paper in the university. And so I could put affirmative action in the context of all of our hiring. It soon became clear that we in HEW had different goals. I'm okay. HEW was looking at this basically as a labor problem. That is, they wanted to achieve equity in the hiring and treatment of faculty, and they wanted affirmative action to remedy past discrimination. We, on the other hand, had a different set of goals. One of them included, of course, not getting in trouble with HEW. But much more important was to ensure that whoever we hired added to the educational experience of our students. That was primary. And second was that whomever we hired increased our scholastic and research capabilities, the two fundamental things that the university does. There was this difference. Let me talk about what the feds were requiring in a little more detail. They wanted a determination of the makeup of each department with respect to race and gender. They wanted us to compare that to the data on the availability of relevant doctorates, and then provide hiring goals where there was underrepresentation, numerical hiring goals. And they wanted an action-oriented program to achieve those goals. As Faculty Affirmative Action Officer, I did those detailed analyses, and what was no surprise was that there was no statistical underutilization of Blacks or Chicanos or Latinos on the faculty because of the low doctorate acquisition rates, but there was underutilization of women. Nevertheless, we made a decision to not present numerical goals. To us, each faculty member was a very special person, and we wanted the hiring of faculty to be determined by what outstanding researchers and teachers were available, and we felt that numerical goals would slant that process away from what we really wanted to achieve. It was pretty clear. Now, I should say that Ann Miner had already performed an analysis of the situation of women, and you can get a pretty clear idea of the situation from her graph that's right out of her report, Academic Employment of Women at Stanford. And you can see the center column is the number of academic council members on the faculty. The right hand is the percentage of PhDs, Stanford PhDs, in each of those fields. The real potential worrisome areas were law, education, the humanities and social sciences, and medicine, with some concern in the physical sciences and engineering. But again, I stress, we did not present numerical goals. As we thought about it more, we decided the men and women that we hire under affirmative action must meet the same standards of outstanding scholarship and good teaching that we anticipate for all the white male faculty. Why were we so insistent on that? We were going to clearly have more and more women, Black and Chicano students as time went on. We could just anticipate that. We wanted a faculty that would inspire those students to do their very best, to achieve their potential. And we saw that we had to have truly outstanding affirmative action faculty as we demanded for all faculty. The other thing was that there were prevalence of stereotypes in the society that said that basically the intellectual capabilities of women and Blacks and Chicanos were inferior to those of white males. We wanted all our students to see the very best scholarly minds to, in a way, act against those stereotypes. So that was our fundamental view of affirmative action. On the other hand, we also had to be prepared to face HW, which might scrutinize every faculty, white male faculty that we hired. And because of those goals, we changed a lot at the university. First of all, in defining a new position, and there were some, whereas from time to time they were very narrowly defined, sometimes just so that one specific individual could meet the requirements. We required that the positions be broadly defined within the needs of each department. The second was that searches could not be limited to the Old Boys Network, that we had to go broadly, such that it was highly likely that every relevant person could hear of the position. That meant sending either lots and lots of letters out to different departments and or public advertising of the positions, and also ensuring that the relevant minority and women's organizations also heard of the position. Third, we expected a very systematic selection procedure in which the best candidate, as perceived by the department or the program, was recommended for appointment. If that person was not a woman or a minority group member, then we expected a comparison of the recommended person with the very best woman or minority in the applicant pool. Finally, we expected evidence of promise in teaching, either good teaching already or promise of good teaching. Jim Gibbs, who was Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, insisted upon that. We had then the review process of the school and the provost staff and the advisory board to ensure that those requirements had been followed, that the search was appropriate, that the selection process was appropriate. However, we also made room for what we called special opportunity appointments. That is where a department or a program identifies an outstanding person whom we might attract who would add significantly to the university, either in the department or in the university as a whole. And then we still expected evidence that the person was truly outstanding and could teach well. So there were two options for hiring. I believe that the adoption of those procedures is partly responsible for the phenomenal rise of the quality of Stanford's faculty and the stature of Stanford's faculty in the years that followed. Although partly motivated or strongly motivated by affirmative action, it had much more broader implications. Now, faculty affirmative action is quite different from undergraduate admissions. In undergraduate admissions, you have a dean of admissions and an admissions office. They see all the applications and they choose among them. On the other hand, it's the faculty who identify prospective faculty members. And that is fundamental to the institution. You never want to veer from that. So how did we encourage the faculty to follow our procedures? First of all, the provost created a faculty affirmative action fund that could be used, say, to anticipate a retirement when a faculty member was identified, potential faculty member was identified, or when a special opportunity arose. Then all the deans in their own way had their own procedures for following affirmative action. The one that I remember best was because Al Hasdorf enlisted me in it. He was dean of H&S. And Al and I would go around to departments and say, what we want you to do is go to meetings, national meetings, international meetings. And when you spot someone who's going to really add to your department, someone you really want to add, come to us, even though there isn't a billet at the time, and we'll act on it. And also, the critical thing, Al says, is there's no time limit on this. Wait until you find someone you really want. What started to happen was that some departments reported that their top candidates came not from the old boys network, but as a consequence of the very broad search. So the faculty started to hear that, that it's really paying off. The second thing that happened was occasionally, not too often, a search committee in a department would have trouble once they were comparing the affirmative action person and the white male that they wanted to appoint, comparing the two. And they would note that in the papers, and we would say, well, why not hire both of them? And I have to say, Ray Bicchetti was vice provost for budget at the time, and somehow Ray always found the money when these opportunities came along. There were other actions in those early years that I want to talk about. First of all, the med school did a review of all of its research associates and senior research associates. And it found that two of them, Rose Payne and Judy Poole, were in every way acting like professors. They had research grants, they had international reputations, and they were supervising students. And yet they were senior research associates and not faculty members. The med school recommended, by the way, that review was probably initiated at the request of Ann Miner. Not me. The med school recommended them, and we decided to go along with their review. I have to say at the time, there were those in Building 10 and outside of Building 10 who feared that in going forward in transforming and promoting them from associate to faculty member, that we would face lawsuits. Just the opposite happened. That is, there was a woman who was suing us at the time. I'm afraid I've forgotten her name, who, after it was announced that Judy and Rose were going to become full professors, sent me a note saying, look, I think you made a mistake in my case, but since you followed this procedure and you implemented it, I'm withdrawing my lawsuit. Unfortunately, she left the university and went east and developed a major reputation. We made a mistake there. We introduced a delay for maternity in the tenure decision with the provision that it had to be initiated by the woman involved and not by the department. We did not want the departments to use this as a sort of club over the woman, but it to be for the woman's convenience. We made it clear that you could have part-time tenure. And there was an interesting case with that. I was in my office one night, late at night, after, it was in the evening, and I got a phone call from Renato Rosaldo, who said he and Shelley each had tenured full-time appointments. We want to change it to the two of us having 1.5 full-time appointments, and we want the option of who's going to teach as part of that 1.5. And I listened to it, and I said, is it okay with your department chair? And he said yes, and knowing Renato, I trusted him. Bill Miller was downstairs in Building 10 that evening too, so I walked downstairs to Bill's office, and we discussed it for about 5 minutes, and Bill said, I don't see anything wrong with that. Do you? And I said, I don't see anything wrong with that. And Bill said, well, you got to check it with Halsey Royden, who was dean of H&S at the time. So the next morning, I went in and chatted for about 5 minutes with Halsey over it, who said, I don't see anything wrong with that. And I called Renato and said, yes, go ahead. So we spent about less than half an hour on that administrative decision. I was told that the American Anthropological Society devoted a morning session to discussing that, more time than we devoted to it. But the part-time tenure was, again, the goal of making the university more attractive for women faculty. We made it clear that we allow the appointment of the two related faculty members in the same department to be in the same department, husband and wife, husband, or partners, with only the condition that they, one, not act on the appointment or promotion or salary of the other. But otherwise, there were no restrictions. At the same time, we were fortunate that Ann Miner, Amy Leifer, Dorothea Almond, Phyllis Craig were fighting or campaigning for child care facilities. And we just responded to that, the university did, by helping to create the Arboretum Child Care Center. Finally, I would each year review every salary of a faculty member to ensure equity. Well, what were the consequences of that? In June 1972, I gave a report to the Academic Senate in which I reported that 19 women and 13 ethnic minorities will join the Stanford faculty in the fall. 2 of those were Bill Gould and Barbara Babcock, and that was really significant to me. Tom Ehrlich recommended them very early in the game. As I said, we had been saying that we were going to stick to our standards. There was skepticism among the white male faculty that we didn't really mean it, and there was skepticism among the women and minority faculty that we would use that to prevent or limit the number of women and minorities appointed to the faculty. Getting Bill and Barbara, 2 people of superb quality, both of whom later had presidential appointments in Washington, convinced me that we could do it. Among the people we appointed that year were Jerry Porras and Myra Strober in the GSB, Donald Harris in economics, Jean Franco, a name you probably don't know, an outstanding scholar in Spanish and Portuguese, Alfredo Castaneda, our first tenured Hispanic Chicano faculty member, Scott Momaday, a Native American Pulitzer Prize winner for his book, Housemaid of Dawn, and Clay Bates in material science, generally considered to be one of the 2 or 3 best black engineers in America. There was many others. I just don't remember all the others, nor could I read. But I want to stress that those faculty appointments didn't result from the central administration. They resulted from the faculty searching and finding these people. It was the faculty who did it. The following January, Bill Miller gave a report on affirmative action, and things had gotten even better by then. Of the 90 new faculty appointed, 22 were women, 9 were blacks, 5 were Chicanos. And if you compare that with where we were before the affirmative action program, we increased the number of women on the faculty by about 40%, and we almost doubled the number of blacks and Chicanos on the faculty. Going aggressively that first year paid off. We did not do as well the next year. Of the 87 faculty appointed that year, 18 were black, were women, 3 were black, and 3 were Chicano. None were Chicano. 4 women were promoted to tenure, and 4 new women were appointed with tenure. So you can see where our faculty went by then. But the Chicano situation was really disappointing, and it was even more disappointing because 4 faculty members, Arturo Islas, Jim Leckie, Jerry Porras, and Renato Rizaldo, had gone to enormous efforts to identify potential candidates. And we worked closely trying to convince the schools to appoint those people. Later, Al let me not go through each year, but skip ahead to where we are now. We're now about a third women on the faculty, whereas we were 5% in 1971. And that has been a major change. When I came to Stanford in material science, there were no women on the faculty, and there was only one woman graduate student. Now, 16% of the faculty are women, well known in their field, and a third of the graduate PhD students are women. It's a remarkable change within engineering, and the other departments have had similar things. When you look at the makeup of the faculty, it's now 62% white, 19% Asian. We were required to appoint, to report on Asian Americans to HEW, but that was not a focus at the time. What's really disappointing is that we're only at 6% Hispanic, and that includes all Latinos, not just Chicanos, and 3% Black. After all these years, that's where it stands. And I want to comment on that because it's been a focus of a lot of my concerns in recent times. With all our efforts, Hispanics only represent 9% of our doctorates now, and 7% of our Blacks getting doctorates. This was in 2022, where I had good statistics. And that's part of the reason we have the low percentage of them on the faculty. On the National Science Board, I got to thinking of the following question or concern. If you look in the general society, Blacks and Latinos have become prominent in so many different areas. Why is it that their participation in doctorates is so low? And I reached the conclusion, I go back to what Bob Huff said when I first came. You want to keep the loan component as low as possible if you expect students to go on to graduate school. When you look more carefully at the situation, you see it just doesn't make sense for those in the lower economic strata to go and pursue a doctorate compared to being an MBA or a lawyer or an engineer with a master's degree or something of the sort. Why is that? Because those in the lower economic strata, by and large, graduate with a great deal of debt. If they go on to graduate school, they acquire almost, on average, a lot more debt because we underfund our graduate students. And then they go to a postdoc that pays $50,000 or $60,000. The debt accumulates, and the means of paying off the debt become minimal. It just doesn't make sense economically. And that's true not only for Blacks and Chicanos and Latinos, but for the white population in the lower economic strata. I close on this because of my belief that we as a nation are losing out on a lot of talented people. Remember Luis Nogales and Charles Ogletree, both of whom came from very poor backgrounds and rose to prominence and did wonderful things for the country. We're losing out on similar people because of the way we structure the finances of higher education. And it's fixable. The public universities could fund their universities better. We could make Pell Grants better than where they were when they were initially founded. We could have other national scholarships. This is a fixable problem, and we should do something about it. Thank you.
We now have some time for questions and answers. Based on your experience, how do you think we can best counter or deal with the arguments that are being made nationally today that seem to de-emphasize many of the programs and the approach that you've been proposing?
I don't know if I can answer that generally, but let me talk about the STEM workforce, okay? That's one that I know well because I had responsibility at OSTP and on the National Science Board. When I went to OSTP in '97, it was also a period in which there were referenda against affirmative action, and there were the court decisions against affirmative action. And I asked the following question: what will be the consequences if we fail to get more women, blacks, and Latinos into the STEM workforce, given the fact that the percentage of the population that is black and Latino is expected to rise to just about 40% of the total population by 2050, according to census bureaus. We studied that problem, and we reached the conclusion that if we fail to increase the participation, then if every group, white males, white females, blacks and Latinos, and Asian Americans, contributed to the STEM workforce in the percentage that they were when I was in Washington, that the fraction of the workforce between 18 and 65 would decrease, whereas starting at the end of the Civil War till up to then, it had gradually increased, and as we looked at the future job market, STEM was going to be very important. That had critical consequences for the country. We depend on the STEM workforce to increase productivity. If we allow the STEM workforce to decline in capability, it will affect everything, Social Security, all sorts of things. Remember, the population was aging and we needed high productivity. So we issued a report on that, and the University of Michigan used it in their affirmative action case. I think we have to base our arguments on the importance to the nation of using the capabilities of all of our students. This is a very complex society, and it depends on having educated, competent people in state and local and national government, in the professions, in education, the arts. This society depends on those people. We've got to ensure that all of our citizens are not limited by finances and other barriers to obtaining higher education.
Now, we also have two microphones. Norma's on this side, and Charlotte is over there. So please raise your hands for questions, and there's a question right up there, Norm.
So I'm just curious, Artie, I know how careful Stanford leaders are in who they choose to do important things for the institution. So do you have any idea what they saw in you that that didn't come out quite right? You know what I mean, Artie. What you indicated, for example, that you quickly earned people's trust. So I suppose they quickly saw some quality in you that made them feel they could trust you. So just...
To be honest, when I look back, I cannot figure out what was on the mind of the committee on committees Appointing me to that chair was completely inappropriate. And as I said, I walked into it quite naive. I had no sense of what I was going to face in the 3 years. The Financial Aids Committee had been routine, and I think they made me chair because I was willing to fundraise for financial aids. So I really don't know, you know. I think, though, when they saw what CUAFA did, remember, in some ways, CUAFA was one of the first demonstrations of simultaneously faculty power and faculty responsibility. So many of these matters had been handled by the administration previously. We insisted on dealing with them ourselves, of course, as people who recommended to the Academic Senate. When I look back historically, perhaps one of the most important things this university did was to form an academic senate with defined responsibilities. And where other universities have had faculty administration conflicts, it is those defined responsibilities and the responsible implementation of them that have made for relative peace on this campus.
Other questions, please?
All right, there we go. You mentioned that the provost's office provided salaries for affirmative, we'll call them affirmative action hires. How long were those salaries paid from the provost's office? Were they for the entire career of the faculty member, or just to get them through the first stages? And was there any backlash within the departments of the sense, the feeling that that person would not have been hired had not money come from the provost's office?
First of all, the money part. The money would go into the department's budget. Lots of times we anticipated a retirement. That is, the appointee would fill a billet that didn't exist until some other faculty member retired, okay? But it basically went into the department. The Faculty Affirmative Action Fund sort of disappeared or became invisible. And indeed, we tried to keep it invisible. I myself didn't hear of any kickback from the faculty that we were hiring people who were less capable. But Bill Gould told me once that he faced those statements, you know, about his own appointment. That's the only one I heard about. So, you know, the thing is, you sit in the building 10, and a lot goes on in the university that you just don't know about. So I can't talk definitively.
John, do you have any online questions?
Yeah, sure. We have a couple that are more behind the scenes and about sort of the politics and political economy. One question is, what strategy worked best in getting department chairs on board with the Faculty Diversity Initiative?
I think, you know, the one that I was closest to was Al Hasdorf in H&S, okay? As I said, it was the opportunity of a department to get an extra faculty member. They always wanted an extra faculty member. So that was the big thing. My memory is Art Coladarchi was Dean of Education, and he saw bilingual education becoming important for the country, and particularly for the West, and they wanted a program in bilingual education. Hiring Alfredo Castaneda was a natural for that, and also later Arturo Pacheco. You know, so individual deans and department chairs saw opportunities to meet specific needs, and we were basically giving them a carrot.
Other questions?
Well, there's a follow-up to that. I guess going higher up, I guess there's a question about the role of Dick Lyman, the president, and all this.
I primarily interacted with Bill Miller. I was a vice provost, he was provost. But remember that Dick and Jing had been active in housing issues, trying to find housing for minorities. Jing was a forceful advocate for women at the university. So there. But my primary link was to Bill and Pat. And there again, Pat was involved with Planned Parenthood efforts until she left because Planned Parenthood was too conservative and became part of something even closer to her ideas. And Bill was very supportive of that, So at the very top, I had enormous support. And as I say, critical as well was Ray Bacchetti, who had the budget responsibilities. And Ray was an advocate as well, and as I said, always found the money.
A question sent in before this program a couple of days ago was this: what part did Arturo Islas play in this effort to diversify? Let me first say, to explain who Arturo Islas was and then his impact.
Arturo Islas was a professor of English, a good friend of mine. Arturo was notable for two reasons. One, he was a person who could teach everything from Shakespeare to Chicano literature. And the second was that he and Diane Middlebrook gave joint taught courses that were very popular with the students. They were just superb teachers, the two of them. He was also a very good novelist. I've read several of his novels. As I said before, Arturo was part of the group initially of 4 and then of 5 that identified potential Chicano faculty and brought them to the attention of the relevant search committees or deans or what have you. Unfortunately, Arturo caught AIDS and passed away. We lost someone who a lot of us cared for very much.
Any more questions? Yes.
I just wanted to say a word and maybe get a response about Fred Hargadon. I was not here during the events you're describing. I came in 1982, but Fred Hargadon was my political science teacher at Swarthmore College in the early 60s. And you may know he never finished his thesis. He went into the admissions field at Swarthmore.
Huh.
And you must know, he had been through a traumatic experience relating to the first cohort of black students at Swarthmore. There was discontent. I was not on the campus, so I can't give you the details, but they occupied the admissions office. Fred was the target of their protest. And the reason it was so traumatic was the college president, Courtney Smith, was then on sabbatical, but he came to try to attend to the crisis and had a heart attack and died. And so that kind of bitterness on both sides lasted. So Fred then came to Stanford. And, he was known both at Swarthmore and I think at Stanford too as a relatively conservative figure on these kinds of issues. He favored the well-rounded students, the student body president, and so on. So it's very striking to me to see you identifying him as really the carrier, the implementer of really the first major upward step and then later upward steps in the diversification. So I'm pleased to see it. I don't know if you wanted to comment.
Well, I think in that era, we were conservative too. to say no to the BSU demands and the Metro demands was, in one sense, a conservative act. On the other hand, I think that affirmative action still has a positive connotation on this campus. And the connotation is positive because we insisted on excellence and we were prepared to go aggressively to find it. And Fred was a part of that. We were all conservative compared to what was going on at the time.
Oh, yes, please, one other question. Hi, Jerry.
As a student of organizations, one of the things that it's been pretty clear to me over the years is that very often change is either blocked or promoted really successfully by the people who are more in the middle. The people at the top have a certain amount of power, et cetera. The people in the middle often make the big difference. In the situation of hiring faculty, clearly the faculty at the bottom are the decision makers in a lot of ways. But what is often, to me, has been a disappointment is the role of the deans. It seems to me that whenever I've talked to a dean about hiring a Latino, they always say, well, I'd love to, but it's the faculty at the bottom that make the decision. When I step back and note, however, then whenever a dean wants to have something happen and a person appointed, somehow or another it happens. So what, in your opinion, can be done to really motivate and inspire deans to be much more aggressive about the pursuit of minority faculty members? Because my belief is that they're out there, and we may steal them from a smaller place, but they're going to have a bigger impact at this place than they would wherever they're at in terms of advancing minorities and inspiring students to become faculty members. So to me, the dean's role, I think, is one that has been overlooked. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on exactly how deans might be motivated by the higher-ups, like the provost, to become more aggressive about convincing their faculty that hiring minorities is an important part of what the school should be doing.
If I were Faculty Affirmative Action officer now, recognizing the validity of what you just said, I would study each dean and see what that dean wants to accomplish and ask the question, how can I help to accomplish that through the hiring of a Latino or a Black faculty member? I think part of what success we had in affirmative action comes from the fact that we proceeded in a manner that was consistent with fundamental university goals. So that would be my approach. It's an approach that I followed in the White House and on the Science Board as well. I would probably, again, always have a faculty affirmative action fund and encourage the Chicano faculty to identify people and use that. But in the end, it's the faculty who will make we have to do searches for the very best people.
Any further questions? Yes.
Yeah, there were a number of questions.
May I just say one thing, please?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think that putting the burden on Latino faculty to find Latino prospects sounds like a really logical idea and a powerful one. But in my experience of 30 plus years on the Stanford faculty, I found that doing that actually was the kiss of death, because there was some implication on the part of the person I was trying to influence that the only reason I was recommending someone was because they were Latino. and not because they were that great, which to me just seems to be an absurd position to take, because why would I risk my reputation recommending someone who is no good and would be proven to be no good, which would be a reflection on me. So it seems like an idiotic thing for me to be doing. But it seems to me that that perspective exists and has existed in my experience, so that the process of having Latinos suggest Latinos is really a risky one, and I don't think works very well.
I don't know how to respond to that, Jerry.
I think we can have one more, John. You wanna
Yeah,
have
there were a
one
number
more?
of questions about Asian American, both undergraduate admissions and also faculty, if there were any initiatives, and then also any remarks about the outcomes.
The rise in Asian participation in the student body and the faculty came sort of naturally, and I don't think we as an administration did anything one way or another. You notice that they are represented on the faculty at a level almost twice their representation in the general population. I should comment, remember I speak about debt. When you look at median family or average family incomes in the country, Asians stand at the top, and then you have whites, and then blacks and Latinos. And that also represents the ability of families to help their undergraduate students financially. So when you look at debt, average debts upon graduation, Asian Americans least, and then whites, and then blacks and Chicanos. Then, you look at doctorates awarded, and Asian Americans get doctorates at about twice the rate of whites in America. It's a striking figure because, we get a double benefit from those immigrants from Asia. They come with skills, they join our faculty, and then their children also contribute markedly to the STEM workforce, one of my big concerns. So it all happened naturally, and so we didn't have to do anything as far as I could tell. Yeah. And if you look by their representation in the population, you could say they're overrepresented. But as I say, we admit on the basis of the applicant pool.
Well, let me just say quickly that the benefit is even better than that, because a lot of these Asians come here as graduate students and get their undergraduate education in their home country, which we don't pay for.
That's a big factor. I mean, as the states have pulled back on their commitment to public education, higher education, it's a real factor. And I think it's critical that the nation turn around their support of public education. I mean, we're fortunate to be in a well-endowed private institution, but we've always got to remember that the bulk of our graduates come from the public universities, and they deserve our support.
Thank you, Artie. What's important about this program is that Artie was right there at the beginning of it all, worked through it, and we are now on record, and we have this recorded in the archives, and I think it's a very important program, so thank you. One word about the Historical Society. As you know, we're open to all. We're a volunteer organization. We make our program, we use funds that we have for donated and so forth, and so we recruit members. Anybody can become a member. People, any place in the country. We have many members around the country. And if you're interested in joining or supporting the Historical Society, just check our website, Historical Society, one word, at .stanford.edu.